One of the things I talked about over and over when I talked about the lecture series on evolution is the idea that the Earth is incredibly old. And remember that the Earth is not the only place in the universe, and so there is possible for life to have evolved somewhere else, even if it didn't evolve on Earth, because the universe has had millions of attempts at life, because there's millions of stars, millions of planets, and billions of galaxies and so forth. So that means that evolution is almost a certainty, even though the chances of life seem to be so minute. But when you talk about Earth itself, Earth is a very, very old thing. It's almost 5 billion years old. It's pushing almost close to 5 billion years old. And it's got to have a long period of time. And life did not evolve in the Earth really until it was already almost 1 billion years old. And that's when you find the first life forms, the prokaryotes, bacteria, simple life forms. And then a group of prokaryotes would develop photosynthesis. You start getting more oxygen in the atmosphere. That would accelerate the process of metabolism, accelerate sexual reproduction, and things will start happening. You're going to start getting eukaryotic life and sexual reproduction. You're going to start seeing eventually multicellular eukaryotes, and then much later you're going to see animals and plants and different kinds of animals and different kinds of plants. That is the process of life. And there's so much that I would have to talk about to really do justice to what we call the history of life. So in this lecture series, what I wanted to focus on is the idea of the history of life, the natural history of our world. But what I'm not going to do in this lecture series is actually tell you step by step everything that happened in the history of life. When we talk about taxonomy, one of the things we do there is we talk about the progression of evolution. So I'm not already going to do that kind of when I do taxonomy. I already talked about that on Earth-Based Science Lecture Series when I talk about geological events and how the Earth changed throughout history. I mentioned a little bit about the steps of evolution. So if you want to know about that, watch the lecture series on the links down below and you will see a little bit more about that. So I am not going to go in detail on each of the steps that occur in the history of life. I'm not, even because there's a lot that is still not exactly clear in science about the order that things took place. We're still on the process of analyzing fossil record, molecular evidence from DNA comparative analysis, and molecular clocking. There's a lot that still needs to be done for us to understand exactly the steps that led us to have the diversity of life that we had today. What we do know, though, is that the process of evolution is what led us from the origin of life to the life that we had today. And things like mass extinctions, adaptive radiation, coevolution, spatial and temporal distribution of patterns of diversity, small changes over long periods of time in isolated populations, pressures changing over time, genetic drift, new mutations, all the things we talked about in this unit explain how the evolution actually took place and how all of these different life forms exist. And then we have all the evidence from molecular biology, from morphology, from anatomy, biogeography, actual examples of microevolution that have been observed, examples of macroevolution that have been observed, parsimony, embryology, molecular analysis, all of the things we talked about, the fossil record, plenty of evidence to substantiate that this is the case. But when you talk about the history of the Earth, you're talking about thousands of years. So seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, decades, centuries, even millennium is not enough for you to quantify the passage of time. So we have what it's called a time scale in terms of geological time scales, where we're not talking about thousands of years, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years in between. And these are split into epochs. Epochs are smaller chunks of time, call it several millennia put together. And then you have periods, which are several epochs put together. And then you have ages or eras, which are several periods put together. And then you have eons. Eons, which are, several eras put together. And this is a picture of all the divisions of the scientists used to split the times. So you have 4 major eons. You have the Precambrian time, the Paleozoic time, the Mesozoic time, and the Cenozoic time. Some scientists split the Precambrian time into the Archean and the Proterozoic eons even further. But you can see how there are so many different divisions on life and for timing, because different things happen. Earth was different around each of these times, which led to the development of different things. But in this lecture series, we're going to talk about an overview of the natural history of life. We will talk about how do we get from molecules to protocells, to protobionts. What is the actual evolution of life? We're going to talk about how the genetic code evolved. we're going to talk about the first unicellular organisms and evidence that we have for them in the shape of stromatolites. We will talk about the evolution of eukaryotic life. We will talk about photosynthesis in the oxygen revolution. We will talking about the evolution of multicellularity and cell specialization and differentiation. We will talk about the evolution of sex and what sex did for evolution, and it sped up the process of variation and the evolutionary process. We will talk about the advantages of sexual versus asexual reproduction. We will talk about the Cambrian explosion, about the evolution of plants, the evolution of animals, and finally, the evolution of humans. And we're also going to talk about future of evolution and what are the trends that we're currently seeing and what life is currently headed towards. But if you want a full, detailed history of the evolutionary process, find a book and read about it, because I'm certainly not going to watch a lecture series about that, because there's way too much to talk about. As you can see, look at how many divisions of time there are. But if you want to learn a little bit more about it, you can do an extra credit project for this class that's called the Geological Timescale Project, where I list a series of the most important facts about evolution. And your job is to puzzle them out and put them in the right order. And you can do that to learn a little bit more about the actual history of the Earth and the steps in which they took place. I hope you learned a lot in this lecture series, and I'll see you there.